All right, so it's the official recording chime. Okay, so welcome to this PAR webinar. Today is Monday, March 29th. I'm Bailey Smolarek, and I'm here with Mrill Ingram, and she is a participatory-based research scientist at the UW-Madison Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems, who specializes in sustainable agricultural environmental networks, human and non-human relationships, and participatory research. Dr. Ingram earned her MS in geography from UW-Madison and later her PhD from the University of Arizona. She's the author of numerous books, articles, and popular press publications, including the forthcoming book, Loving Orphan Space, The Art and Science of Belonging to Earth, and that's with Temple University Press. So thank you so much for being here. To begin, Mrill, would you tell us a little bit about the Center for Agriculture or Integrated Agricultural Systems, where you work and your work there?
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation, Bailey. And I'm sorry I can't see your faces yet. Maybe they'll get figured out, but thank you for being here today. And I do hope that you'll put things in the chat or just interrupt at any point, Bailey, if there's a clarification or anything else. I didn't want to go on and on with a PowerPoint, but I do want to share my screen just for a little bit, just to help talk through some of the specifics of where I am right now with the Center for Integrated Ag Studies, since that's here on campus and maybe of some interest to some of you in particular. Let me just see if I can get this big view. All right, how's that look? Is that good, Bailey? Thumbs up.
It's loading right now. There we go. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. Okay. So about a year ago, a little more than that, just before COVID kind of clamped down on everything, I came back to the university. I have worked on and off campus over the years in a number of capacities, but I had an opportunity to be part of the Center for Integrated Ag Studies and had the pretty awesome title of Participatory Action Research Scientist, which I have been trying to grow into. And I sort of appreciate this opportunity to talk to you all as kind of a way to expand it. And that's sort of in part because the center is also constantly at work evolving and trying to think about how it can be a good sort of organ. And I think about it like a stomata, which are those cells on a leaf that are part of how the gas exchange and breathing of plants happen. But there's a way that people at the center really want to support people around the state of Wisconsin in pursuing sustainable forms of agriculture that are good for them in a number of ways. And the center was created very much in response to public pressure. The 80s were a time, there have been these kind of surges of over history around land grant universities when people, farmers, and also others have really criticized land grants for a number of things. And I think probably your class has been talking about a lot of them. This is a conversation around a kind of colonial approach to knowledge generation, the history of land grabbing and ownership and making money off of tribal lands. There are many ways that the history of land grants implicated in things that have been very extractive. And during the 80s, there had been a number of publications in particular about how research had been very much supporting a kind of production agriculture, which people had kind of gotten quantitative data around that had been very hard on small farmers in particular, and it really pushed a kind of industrial approach. So the center was formed, and I think you'll probably recognize some of these bullet points here, that the idea was to figure out how to listen to what the community wanted and needed, and to respond to their research goals, to involve people in the community in the research process all the way through, and to really acknowledge kind of local expertise and knowledge, and the contributions of all of its members. And so in that set of goals, we have the CAC, which is a kind of community action coalition, but it is a group of people from across Wisconsin who come together, and we meet with them regularly and involve them in all kinds of ways, often listening, but having them kind of give feedback on research projects. They participate in on-farm research and really help us try to set priorities. I wanted to mention a couple of examples. This is a set of tools from, they're called Compass. There's Veggie Compass, Livestock Compass, all kinds of things. But during the 80s, one of the things that had been going on in Wisconsin was both organic agriculture and grazing were something that the community had been developing a lot on their own and really exploring. And there were these knowledge networks that were, in some cases, international, but they were just not well represented at the university. And the kind of Compass grew out of that as a way to help gather this knowledge and help support it within the land grants. And now at this point, you know, organic and grazing are both much more kind of mainstreamed, and you will see them taught in all kinds of different departments across campus, but that did not used to be the case. And so at this point, the center is constantly sort of looking for new challenges and ways of responding to people. One of the things I participated in this last year during COVID was a kind of citizen science effort where we worked with farmers, many of them in new parts of the state, because people are interested in cover cropping. And cover cropping isn't a particularly new technology for farmers, but it has gained new significance because of increased flooding and issues around sort of soil health and water quality becoming more apparent to many farmers. And then opportunities to kind of support different, whether it's producing forage for dairy cows or producing a kind of second crop. There are possibilities there for increasing one's profits. And
I'm going to pause you for just 1 second. Would you be able to just define cover cropping?
Oh, sure, of course.
Thanks.
So cover cropping is basically, in a general sense, the notion that you've got green and cover on your fields the whole time. So if you're in a classic kind of corn and soybean rotation, which is most of the farming land in Wisconsin, there are times after harvest when the land will be essentially, quote, brown, but will be sitting without a crop on it. And so a cover crop is where you go in and plant after harvest, or just before harvest or something. So the plants are small, but there's always something growing. And many of these can actually overwinter and kind of hold onto the soil. There's just a lot of questions about which kind of species to use, when to plant, what kind of equipment to use. Are you doing perhaps more damage by getting in with big equipment and disturbing the soil more? So it's this kind of work in progress. And in Wisconsin, especially further north, people have less experience with cover cropping. So it can be thought of as a kind of emerging technology in some ways, but it's supported by the NRCS, which is the USDA wing of kind of conservation efforts, and that farmers can get help with payments for using cover cropping technology. So the government kind of supports this as a way to deal with environmental issues. And so this citizen science effort had farmers sign up. We were able to pay them a little stipend for their time, and they filled out a survey. And then we also collected crop samples on their farm to see how well. So this is kind of the beginning of something where we're both also collecting questions from them and trying to engage in conversations about what they're using and what kind of questions they continue to have. Because like I said, it's this complicated, and everything is different in place, of course. So the soil is different, and the temperature gradients are different, and the length of your growing season is different. So we're trying to put some more locally specific information together. That's the thing I've been working on. So I'm just sharing this sort of for the heck of it, but one of the really key things here, and I say this in part because I feel a little bit of a rub here being at the College of Ag. In life sciences, people are very goal oriented, and they can, they can see products they want to deliver, they want to produce data on something, but there is a way, a kind of cycle, perhaps you're familiar with participatory action research, where you spend some time routinely reflecting and slowing down. And I was just messing around with some images one day, but this one on the left there, this represents decades a long process where people were working at CIAS, we're working with apple growers around the state, really listening to their interest in ways to manage their fields using fewer pesticides. And that started with apples, and then it grew off into cherry and berry growers. But there was these regular meetings and grant making and other things, but a very kind of cyclical way of coming back around to talk to people and figuring out what to do next. So in terms of that sort of creating the path as you go idea is critical. And I guess I just wanted to say one other thing in response to the participatory action approach, and in my own work, is that I worked with the Farley Center, which is just sort of south of town, just past Epic, if you know where that is. And the Farley Center has programs that support immigrant farmers in a number of ways, in particular, giving them tools to think about access to land and skills around business management. And really, I learned a lot about the many barriers there are to getting started in farming, from, in particular, just being able to afford land, but working out a rental agreement with people can actually be full of challenges, water access, and then of course, accessing markets and everything else. So the Farley Center put together this sort of suite of toolkits and videos and other things, trying to support a number of new farmers getting a start in growing things around Madison.
So was that work in particular a PAR study, or how have you kind of used PAR research throughout this work, and how are you thinking about community involvement in this sort of work?
Yeah, well, I think the notion of creating the path as you go and having routine ways of listening to communities and including communities in the work is really key. And at the Farley Center, we had a group of farmers who basically helped to shape the curriculum in a number of ways. And we were trying to facilitate and respond to what they were recognizing. And there's a lot of national resources. And so kind of bringing them to be available to folks in Madison and tailoring them to be suitable for a local audience was some of the work that we did. And, things as basic as translation, but then also, and as hands-on as like helping navigate a rental contract with people who were maybe from different cultural backgrounds, and there were kind of different expectations. Just around, like, if you rent to one person, well, that one person may actually have a whole family that's going to come out to a piece of land and farm it. And there will be many cars and different people there. And so that has to, that in one case I'm thinking of was sort of a surprise to the renter who had not expected to have so many people involved. And so it was a matter of kind of cultural translation. So that's that kind of action piece, and that was really more applied at the Farley Center than it was research. But I think at the center, there's a circulatory system there where we're writing grants and really trying to involve the people who are who are part of a study and helping shape that
Right.
as we go along.
Right.
I guess that's one slide a little too far. I guess the other thing I just wanted to say before I launch into this other piece
Mhm.
was that um, one of the reasons I became interested in participatory action research was that I was reading about John Gaventa at the Highlander Center
Mm.
in Tennessee.
Mhm.
And I had come across that work after I had been working as a sort of as a science journalist. That was one of my earliest jobs. And I began to feel uncomfortable at the way that I felt like I was just this sort of cheerleader and one-way conduit for information to people. So my job as a journalist was to say, oh, look, isn't this cool? Look what scientists are doing. And I'm just putting it out to people like it was absolutely a given good that they should know everything that the scientists were saying. And I began to realize that I didn't really know who I was talking to, and I didn't know how this information was going to impact them, and particularly when sometimes this research was coming out of a community and maybe the research was on something like a crop or an animal that this community was perhaps relying on for survival or something. I didn't know anything about the community. I was just writing on this animal. And I began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with that, both because I felt like, well, you know, the one way thing you sort of hit or miss as a journalist, you never know who reads your stuff and whether it makes an impact, but also just that there could be real benefits in trying to work with communities more and to hear what they were doing. And I started to get very interested in something which has just continued across my work as a participatory action researcher, but to really understand things as networks that are two-way, and that there are lots of non-humans in these networks. And because I'm interested in environmental issues, of course, there were all sorts of opportunities to think about that. And so I was just going to mention, oh gosh, sorry. Come on. I was just going to mention this work that I did around these environmental networks, and in particular, how it is that essentially stories can be listened to. As a researcher, I can listen to the kinds of stories and narratives that groups of people are telling, and it will help me understand more about how the environment is being worked with, and how people see themselves as groups and that will maintain over time. And I was really interested in this, say, initially because I was curious about how organic farming and organic farmers got started and continued to build research at a time when they were outside of land grant universities and stuff. They were really not supported by institutions of higher learning. In fact, they were actively denigrated. The Secretary of Agriculture at one point in the early 80s said, we can do organic farming. We just have to decide which, 500,000 people are going to starve to death, because that's what organic farming is. It's just not productive. So it was just this really sideline. But doing research, I began to see how people in these early stages of organics were talking in similar ways about soil and the plants, and that kind of similarity was a similar kind of story that was building real continuity and a sense of the group for people, which helped them exchange information and maintain themselves as a cohesive group over time, and really fight for their essentially their approach, and really build it and talk to more people. So it was this coming together of like the what's essentially almost like a social movement with this, which is essentially research, right? That farmers were out there working with compost piles and plants and other things, and they were essentially creating new ways of growing. So they were doing their own kind of research. Stories were a really important way that they were kind of holding themselves together and keeping themes that were bringing in new people, but helping people kind of feel as part of one group. And at the same time, like a social movement, resist the denigration and the sidelining, and continue to build momentum over time until, at some point, and that's a whole nother story, but organic kind of took off and became a much broader social movement in the United States. But that was built on these knowledge networks of farmers working with their environments. So that's one of the ways that I think about story and human environment relationships and participation kind of all of a piece. I guess I was also I thought I could mention one story from this book, which my colleague Raul Lejano wrote about, but where there was a group in the 90s, sort of 80s and 90s, he was looking at the Turtle Islands, and it's where there's a lot of green sea turtles that nest. And the people in that community had found that there were markets for the sea turtle eggs in Taiwan and other places. And they had were starting to kind of take the eggs from nests after the sea turtles laid them. They would dig them up from the beaches and sell them. And at some point in the early 90s, this really kind of loose-knit group of conservation scientists showed up from somewhere else in the Philippines and started this kind of long-term project working with the community. And they began to tell a kind of common story around these turtles. And they listened to the traditions of the people there around what they knew about the turtles. And among other things, they kind of honored the expertise of these expert egg probers who were able to walk the beaches and feel what was going on in the sand and find these nests and not disturb or hurt the eggs. And some of those skills were obviously initially created in order to both feed themselves, but then also respond to these markets increasingly. And then with the conservationists, they began to sort of understand how there was a possibility of extracting too many eggs that would hurt the turtles. And so over time, by empowering the local people and responding to their kind of existing needs, they were conserving about 70% of all of the eggs that had been estimated that had been laid on the beach. But then in 2001, there was a passage of an international treaty that banned all turtle egg sales. And the community was very upset about this and wrote a letter to the kind of international networks. I can't remember the name of the groups right now, but I think the World Wildlife Fund might have been involved. I mean, these are kind of big players, but also the government, the federal government in the Philippines was involved as one of these kind of green deals, big conservation deals that were decided elsewhere and then applied on this local place. And when that treaty got passed and the local people lost sort of control of the story, essentially they stopped trying to do any of the preservation, and poaching just skyrocketed. And so they actually have data where they can show that when that conservation thing got passed and the story changed, then the protection for the turtle eggs stopped at the same time.
Wow.
So I also saw you had a question, Bailey, just to take a kind of another step about my work on art science.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
let me pause you 1 second though. Let's before I would really like to talk about that. But before we get to there, I was wondering if I know some of our members of the Pontau team have family and friends who farm, and so I was wondering if any of you had any questions based on what Mrill has already talked about. And I also had one other question about the CIAS work. Thinking about the outreach that you're doing, like I'm thinking about my own work as a PAR researcher, and community involved research in general. And can you kind of talk us through your approach to outreach, community outreach? Because obviously it's who is the community, right? Who gets represented? Whose voices get to be a part of all of this? And how do you reach people? Because some people are going to come out and say, I want to be involved, and some people aren't, even though that those perspectives need to be heard as well. So I'm just wondering how you all are thinking about that, and what you've kind of learned at the center so far about trying to engage all different folks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So the our community advisory board, the CAC, is this key way that we try to keep a diverse group of people, that sort of people out working in the state that we can talk to and bring in and consult on a regular basis, and then shape our research around. So that's kind of the main organ, if you will, of the center. And because I've only been here a year, I'm still figuring out how that's best, kind of what's going on in the next steps. And there's actually the center's kind of going through a bit of a revisioning exercise right now. And a lot of the questions are like, well, we've had this structure. Does it, are there things that we can do they're different and new? But we really rely heavily. I mean, I don't know if any of you know Dan Cornelius, but he's I don't know if he's Ho-Chunk. He works with a number of tribes and is involved in research around cultural sovereignty and foodways, and has some really interesting work growing species of corn that are important to indigenous communities around, but that haven't actually been grown in a lot of areas, and actually require, in some cases, tribal elders to grow. And I think that his perspective is really important in trying to just sort of make space for a certain kind of research. And also in particular, I think he's looking at different market structures, so that as people grow certain products, if they want to access markets, how do these smaller supply chains support and bring in income to communities in sort of spread around Wisconsin? So he's an example of one person that is helping kind of diversify, I think, the voices. But a lot, we've, really very much tried to be listening to smaller growers, people who are really kind of pushing the envelope on different kinds of crops, different ways of growing, and also just different ways of supplying. The supply networks are huge. We really saw that in the pandemic, that, in agriculture, there's this huge concentration of a lot of how our food is produced. And so smaller, kind of more locally sensitive networks they can just get kind of overlooked, but they're super important. And if we can figure out how to support and grow them, then there's this real opportunity for smaller growers to access markets and make a profit. And so those are some of the things that we're specifically looking at and talking about as a center right now. It's interesting for me personally, this cover crop project has a slightly different take, because a lot of the cover crop folks I was kind of interested in reaching were, this is a terrible word, but they can be defined as laggards. And that these are conventional growers in a lot of ways, but they are not first responders when it comes to conservation work. But because of pressures around, farming, it's not easy. There's a lot of economic pressures on farming right now, and then increasing environmental ones as there are droughts and then floods and these sorts of things. Market pressures, the trade stuff upset a lot of what people are expecting. All of that mean that farmers are kind of looking around and experimenting with things. And I was really interested in how that project might be used to reach people who are actually pretty conventional in a lot of ways, but that if there was a way to listen to what their concerns were, that even this very conventionally oriented, trying to help like corn and bean growers in Wisconsin, but could actually try to understand how they might be thinking about their environment and sustainability. And so we could really move that conversation to a whole new group, kind of beyond this choir of the folks who are more comfortable talking about the environment and stuff right away. So those are a couple examples.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, how those kind of community-based research ideas would really, could be really applied for that group you're talking about.
Yeah.
Matt, you had a question?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I guess I have two sort of related things I wanted to get your feedback on. One is I guess, I feel like farmers and rural Wisconsin is pretty conservative. And then also the farmers that I know are pretty busy. I was talking to one a little while ago about whether he has time during the winter to kind of leave the farm. And he's like kind of saying that, he's actually pretty busy with maintaining his equipment and stuff throughout the winter months. And I was sort of surprised by that. And so my first question is just like, what challenges are there and how do you negotiate those challenges for engaging with farmers in Wisconsin, getting them to come in? And I know you have the community organization out by Epic that, seems to play a role. The other question that I think relates is you seem to be using this input from growers to inform curriculum and research protocol and research questions that then you do that work and inform, and there's a sort of feedback cycle where you help them with grants and provide resources. And so can you kind of take us through how that works? Because I think that's sort of like one of the big sort of the big tasks of a PAR approach. And so we're real curious about that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And please ask the clarifying questions, because it's easy for me to gloss over this a little bit because I haven't been involved hands-on, right? My tenure is less than a year, and I've been trying to play catch up in a lot of ways in terms of how the center actually does this. And I do think the center, so the Farley Center where I worked is a nonprofit. And when I worked there, we were not in the university. In fact, worked with the university almost not at all. Held it at for the stiff arm, because there was this sort of concern that one can get swept up into these demands around producing research products and really lose track of what a community needed, and this kind of hands-on work. So now that I'm within the university, I'm aware of how the center is very much trying to kind of keep it an open conversation, and is really in a lot of ways informing research at the university. But there are a lot of pressures on it. So to fit into a research institution, which I think make it both incredibly important and also just struggle a little bit. So a couple things, just your first question about the kind of community engagement. We lean heavily on extension, for example, which has a lot of existing networks and has worked in counties in different ways all over the place. And so we don't try to, as a small center, but also just respectful in some ways of the work that's gone on in there, we try to engage with them in order to listen to what they're seeing and hearing, and help work with them in terms of like their field days and other things, so that we can engage with their already existing outreach mechanisms. DATCAP, the Department of Ag and Trade and Consumer Protection, the state agency, has a group of farmer-led watershed groups, which is it's a kind of partnership thing, right? So watersheds are not something that farmers on their own might kind of conceive of and orient around, but with DATCAP funding, there's a way that it has provided support for groups of farmers interested in conservation to come together and then reach out to neighbors. And really the idea is to sort of share a lot of learning, to really support folks that are very cutting edge on conservation stuff, but then really broaden that by farmer to farmer networking. So there are these existing structures that the center tries to engage with. Grazing, for example, is its own networks. It has these farmer developed networks over, as I say, over a long period of time as they had to develop their own research. So there's all kinds of farmer-led groups in Wisconsin that the center tries to work with and engage as part of the way it does its outreach. You had a second question, I think, about taking you through step by step, and the best way is probably to tell a detailed story of one of the projects there, which is a little harder since I didn't do them myself, but to just point to that Apple IPM project, which was well over 10 years long, and it involved the center writing numbers of grants. But what those grants supported was a bringing together of farmers who were orchardists and interested in really lowering the level of pesticide use. They were feeling like they were suffering. There was this level of human health concern. There had been increasing awareness of the costs on the life around pollinators in particular. And then there was just increased consumer interest in organic and like low chemical use fruit, right? Especially for kids. So it was just really a big urgent issue. And the center worked with these growers over a long period of time, and it evolved. The growers were these kind of like right on the front edge of it group at first, and then they started talking to other people and bringing other folks in as they got together and said, well, what about this thing called integrated pest management, which involves you don't spray until you look around first. So you really sort of step away and start to question maybe what the label says on the pesticide and say, okay, well, how do I get more fine-tuned about this? We started bringing in some organic people. And so there was this real evolution and trying to cultivate using the resources of the center to bring in some new science, do some research on farms there so that it was applicable to people in their orchards around this, and then develop curriculums, develop tools, ways of scouting. So with them, having people's own orchards being research sites, and then having regular meetings, and coming back, every year, but then every couple of years writing new grants. So there was both continuity, but then also real reflection, which helped kind of rethink. And eventually that model got, as I say, some berry growers and others, other kinds of orchard people got interested. That also morphed into a kind of cider project, which is pretty fascinating because cider as a product, it's really kind of had a potential, an economic potential in the state, but there's a lot not known, like what kind of apples make good cider, and when do you pick them, and how do you do this? And so that whole technology and supplying that market has been a kind of on-farm project produced in Wisconsin, and CIS has tried to be involved to write grants and bring scientific expertise together with farmers and orchardists and people making cider to support them, whether it's how the variety of apple all the way through to how you actually market and how you access certain supply chains, how you bring people onto your farm if you're gonna do that, like what are the food safety protocols, et cetera, et cetera. So it's that whole thing responding to people's needs that eventually got looked at in the series of grants.
Thank you for that. That's fascinating. And it's amazing to hear how it's kind of spread to beyond apples.
Yes.
Which is really remarkable. I just want to be mindful of time and get a chance to hear a little bit more about the slide that we're seeing now, about the ways that you've integrated art and science, and maybe also if you could help us understand a little bit about how that integration can be used to help share knowledge on a broader scale.
Yeah, so I had been working on environmental issues for quite a while, and at that point I was editor of a journal called Ecological Restoration, which was produced by the Arboretum here on campus. It isn't anymore, but it started there. And I ran a piece by an artist who'd done a who'd done a project where she was looking at how it is that artists were helping communities reckon with pollution. And some of these artists were combining a kind of participatory approach, listening to people and their experiences and using whatever the art was, from, you know, music to visual to a kind of event where you make something happen at a particular time, but with science, so that they were in some cases building things and trying to make things that would actually clean up that pollution or help people heal from something. So I became really interested in this whole notion of restoration, of healing, making better. I did not at that point, until I had done that, realized the role the arts have for a long time played in environmental work. And particularly when I was looking at artists and scientists collaborating together, I saw ways that artists were kind of pulling technologies and science in new directions in order to respond to local community needs. So that just opened this whole research world for me that I have continued to pursue. And this website that you're looking at it's not a funded project anymore, but it was looking at just sort of great big picture, what was going on with artists and scientists engagement, and particularly what kind of institutions are supporting these two. Often, you know, we think of them as like polar opposites, but how do they come together? So because I have a background in environment, I ended up working with a number of environmental artists and pursued several projects, which really ended up in producing this whole set of ideas, which is the core of this book that I just published around what I call orphan space. And let me see what I put in as the next slide here. So I think once you start looking around, all of us are surrounded by these bits and pieces of land. Some are very big, some are very small. And in many ways, they're part of our infrastructure. They're pieces of land that are involved in how we drain water we don't want. Some of these are abandoned plots that are kind of can't be developed because there's polluted soil on them. So these places are like holding our polluted soil. Water drainage, as I say, rights of ways along roads. And it turns out that such open spaces, and if you take this notion of open space and then you include, you know, things like parks and campuses and golf courses, as well as these little bits and pieces of land. If you look at this one survey, looked at 200 cities around the world. It represents and these are cities, and I think this is of course true in towns too, but that 24 to 44% of land is open space. And what I began to learn as I was following artists around who were working in such spaces was that the distribution and the impacts of these is very uneven. Let me see what I have as my next slide here. Here's an example of one of these tiny spaces that has been engaged with by a community. But that many of these spaces that sit empty and are polluted and are sort of a drag in a number of ways, the distribution sits more heavily in communities of low-income folks, also often communities of color. So there's a very uneven distribution to these orphan spaces, and they also represent enormous potential. Because they're spaces of infrastructure, we can kind of take them for granted. Oh, we all just need street terraces, right? Or we have to have right-of-ways. This is a corridor to support these transmission lines, these electrical transmission lines, or this railway line, or this drainage ditch. But in fact, that kind of single purpose, single function approach is not the only way to do things. And artists have come in and working with scientists sort of expanded all of these different ways that, for example, a drainage basin can also be a gathering place for people. It can have sculptures in it. There can be community gardens involved. There can be all kinds of programming that welcome people and installations and the kinds of species that you grow and how you think about bringing in new things and celebrating old things and honoring history can all be activated in these spaces. And so they are a way of really interacting and empowering a local community to kind of express and even serve its own needs. And then, you know, in particular with something like, just take the heat island effect, where you have areas of a city where there is no green space and no trees, and they get really, really hot in the summer, and in an increasingly hot world, that's become more and more of an issue. Well, if these kinds of spaces become activated to really address that issue, there's this enormous potential to help solve a problem. And I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll step back just for the sake of time, and I can tell you a story or two about the book if that fits. But that really it's the way in which, because the artists are participating, it's not just a story about like ecology and function. Like, these plants grow together because the ecology and biology tell us they're good, they're part of this ecological system, and this is part of urban ecology, and it's about balancing you know, the flow of water. And instead what happens is you really keep the human element of that participation centered too, so that people who live there have a voice and they can express what they need, and their relationships with particular plants get to be honored. So you don't have a sort of distant decision made about what should happen in this neighbor space. The neighbors around it are really active in talking and participating in what happens in these spaces. And I think that's really an important thing going forward. And I'm really interested in doing more work on the kind of policy barriers and other kinds of challenges that make it, you know, how people around can be enabled to really participate more and reap more benefits from these ubiquitous single purpose spaces all around us. Okay, I'm just going to stop my screen share right there, because yeah. So, you know, like I say, I can talk for a few more minutes about this orphan spaces work. Bailey, maybe you have a particular question about what I've said so far.
That is absolutely fascinating, to thinking about, you know, the other possibilities for these orphan spaces, or kind of, you know, making these spaces that someone might disregard as someplace that can be really beautiful, and rethinking it is that's really quite amazing. And also, like, it seems like a wonderful fit for participatory and community-based methods and ways of thinking about things, because, well, I'm wondering, well, first, why don't I give other folks a chance to ask questions that would like to. We've got about 5 minutes left. So if you could just put questions right in the chat. And then if nothing pops up, I would just love to hear more about how you're thinking about community decision making and community input when like reimagining these spaces. And then you also mentioned some of the policy barriers involved, and I'd love to hear more about that as well, or kind of how you're thinking about that at least.
Sure. In the project that I wrote about in Fargo, North Dakota, which is it's called World Gardens, or the Fargo Project, and you can look it up. It's actually been nicely documented on the web, so there's a lot of kind of cool things on the website. But that was such an interesting project, because it was a situation where the city has these giant empty basins that were really kind of, they did one thing. They held on to floodwater, but they had a lot of negative impacts. And, you know, they were struggling what to do. Like they knew how to hold floodwater. They did great at that, but they did nothing else. And in fact, had all these negative impacts. And so they invited Jackie Bruckner, who had a history of working around the world with communities who were interested in thinking differently about water and rain and runoff in particular, right? Which I think in Wisconsin, we can appreciate because we get a lot of that stuff. But other communities who don't get a lot, they still think about it because they want to hold on to it. And anyway, it's a really interesting kind of set of questions. What are we going to do with this water? And she worked with a team of research of artists who were from the community. And that was really key because that opened up this conversation that no one had expected. And again, it's that you know, following the path as you go kind of idea, where it's so different from kind of classic scientific research where you write a grant, you set a goal and you try to get there, as opposed to I'm going to listen and I'm going to kind of do this circular work of really researching what's around and then reflecting and planning and doing and then coming back around and around. And a couple of conversations that emerged there was that a lot of the people who lived around this one basin they decided to work in were from far, far away, because Fargo has an enormous refugee community, and that nobody had really asked these refugees kind of what they might do in spaces like these. And many of them were hurting for places to gather, and they had some kind of small church areas and other things, but that particularly outside, and Lutheran Social Services brought folks from all over. So there were Bhutanese and Iraqis and people from Iran and Somalia. And it turned out that that space that they were doing this pilot project in just had a number of different kinds of projects going on that was responding to what this community was talking about. And it was everything from like having gardening space. I guess some women from Bhutan showed up with seeds sewn into the hems of their skirts, to having a kind of performance space, because a lot of the youth were really kind of into a spoken word, but it was a place, so they sculpted into the sides of the basin these kind of stair steps so that people could kind of sit around and be outside. It's a very windy place, Fargo, so this basin was a chance to kind of sit and gather outside down below the wind a little bit, and you know, do spoken word and other kind of poetry stuff out loud. So there was just this whole diversity of things that came out once the city had kind of opened itself up to these conversations. Some of them it wasn't quite ready for. And one of the things I really want to do in the future, and I know I didn't quite get a chance to get to the policy stuff, but one of the things that went on, just to say one word about it, is that there's a lot, like the Parks Department was like, no gardens, they get messy, people don't take care of them, blah, blah, blah. So there are a lot of rules like that, like no plants in the terraces over 3 feet high because it impedes visibility, or you can't do this, you can't. So you have to have a kind of hand grappling back and forth often with cities in order to start to change minds and open up possibilities in a kind of space by space situation to prove that something's possible. And that can involve everything from new coalitions of people to actually new species of plants that prove to engineers, for example, oh, you know, these plants, they grow beautifully, even in a flood basin where they get submerged for 3 days every 2 months or whatever. They don't necessarily know that. So there's this kind of back and forth work that has to happen. But the other thing, and this is also work I want to do, just has to do with what I saw come out emotionally when you ask people about just something like, what does nature mean to you? And people from far away shared things that I'm not sure the folks there were quite knew how to handle. And I know we're at time, so I won't say that too much there, but I think that there is an emotional element to this environmental work, especially when you're looking at land and the history there. And I think being able to anticipate and honor and be respectful, not extractive with that emotional storytelling and sharing is a really interesting challenge that I want to think about more.
Well, thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating. On that note, I'm gonna end the recording and we'll stop the official conversation because we're at time. So thank you so much, Dr. Mrill Ingram, for being here and for sharing all of your work with us. This is just absolutely wonderful.
Well, thank you. And I hope if anybody has questions or wants to follow up on anything, this was a lot going in a lot of different directions. And so I'm totally happy to continue a conversation with any of you.
Great.